Okay, so what we're going to switch to here as a little bit of an intermission, we're going to do a little story time. And I should actually edit the title here real quick. Should have done that first. Ooh. We'll change it to, I guess, just chatting. Let me make sure the chat thing actually loads here. It was a dark and stormy night. So, what I have here, guys, this was something I wanted to do for last year as an idea for fitting in between games. If it was like late in the stream, not enough to start another game, but I wanted to fill the time with a little bit of something. I have here, I'm not sure if how well I can capture it with the light. Let me see if I can get it to Tales for the Midnight Hour. This is an old Scholastic book. We were talking about Scholastic at one point here. I found this, and I was like, oh man, I remember this. Shimmy should remember this too. There's like 4 of them or something like that. You have Tales for the Midnight Hour, More Tales, Still More Tales, and Even More Tales by J.B. Stamper. Yeah, see, Shimmy remembers. And I thought, you know what? Yes, it's a book for kids, but I generally just have such nostalgia for these stories. We're going to do a little bit of story time because it's spooky time. The way I'm going to do this is I'm going to read this first story, one in particular, and then we'll read maybe a couple more. And by we read, I mean I'm going to be reading for you guys. While I'm reading, feel free, of course, to chat amongst yourselves, you know, about what's happening and all that. But I will not interject in between. I'm going to continue straight reading, so I don't want to break the flow of the story. So you guys just get to enjoy a little bit of spoopy horror, which is not really that horror, but I don't know. It's just I think this is like a fun little stupid thing that we can do. So, important question, you know, yes, I do. Thank you. This first story is my favorite one in this book, and it actually is the very first story, too. You guys might be able to tell why it's my favorite after I read it here. They're all fairly short, but I kind of want them that way. I don't want them to be too long. So we're going to do this for a little bit, and then we'll get back to the next game. So, to help us get in the mood, I don't have fire here to throw into. This one here, guys, is called The Furry Collar. All right, and I'll do my best to try to read kind of like in a spooky manner, but also I just want to naturally read. So hopefully you guys will enjoy this little intermission. Susan was my best friend, but I try never to think about her. It's only on certain nights when I'm all alone in my room that I remember. It was during Christmas vacation last year when Susan asked me to stay at her house overnight. She lived in a big, gloomy house set way back from the road, and she didn't want to be alone there at night. Her parents had gone to visit some friends and wouldn't be back until the next afternoon. Susan said we could have a really good time without her parents around. And we did. At about 12 o'clock, we decided to get dressed for bed. Susan had gotten this velvet nightrobe for Christmas that had a thick, furry collar. It was blood red velvet, and she looked like someone from a Dracula movie in it. We'd been watching television in the living room, but then we turned it off. We hadn't noticed it before, but now the downstairs seemed too big and almost sinister. We started to go upstairs. Then, all of a sudden, we both ran up the steps to Susan's room as if something was coming up from behind us. After we closed the door, we laughed at ourselves, but neither of us wanted to leave the room again. We sat down and started to talk. That's when we first heard the noise. It sounded like somebody sharpening a knife on an old emery stone. We stopped talking and looked at each other, feeling really scared inside. There was just a thick silence in the room. Suddenly, Susan started to laugh. She said that she had heard a sound like that in the house before. She said it was probably the shutters or something. That made me feel better, and we started to talk again. Then we heard it again. Scritch. Scritch. The sound made my teeth vibrate as if somebody's fingernails were scratching on a chalkboard. But this sound was much worse. It shrieked up from the dark, lonely rooms below us. Scritch. Susan got a wild look in her eyes, as though something horrible had come into her head. Before I could catch her, she ran out of the room, slamming the door shut and flicking off the light switch. I heard her footsteps as she ran down the first flight of stairs, and then stop. I sat in the dark, sick with fright. I called out Susan's name, But my voice was answered by hushed silence. I didn't even want to stay in the dark room alone, but even more, I didn't want to go out into that other darkness. Screech! I heard it again, that disgusting sound. Then I heard Susan's footsteps, moving down the next and final flight of stairs. She went more slowly, as if she really didn't want to. I heard her reach the bottom. I waited in the room, wondering what Susan was doing. I told myself she must be alright. You see, the noise had stopped right after I heard her reach the bottom of the stairs. It didn't come after that. Susan had probably just fixed the shutter. Maybe she had known for sure about that all the time. She had just acted strangely to scare me. Maybe she was sitting on the steps now, laughing at me. I got up and started toward the door to turn the light on, but a feeling of fear swept over me that held me back like a hand against my throat. I decided I would wait there I would wait where I was for Susan to return. I would wait there until her parents returned if necessary. Nothing could make me leave my darkness for that darker unknown outside the room. Time passed. My ears strained for a sound, and my nerves tingled at imagined shadows. Then I heard a slow, shuffling noise on the bottom step. Was it Susan? It had to be. Yet the footsteps seemed too heavy, too deliberate. My heart began to pound, and for a moment I lost control of my mind. It flew to the most horrible corners of my imagination, and I shook with terror. Then, suddenly, I knew what I would do. Susan's new robe with the furry collar. I would wait for the door to open, and then I would reach out and touch the person's neck. If I felt the furry collar, I would know it was Susan, and I would get back at her for scaring me like this. If I didn't feel the furry collar, well, then there was nothing I could do. The shuffling steps had reached the second flight of stairs. I forced my own feet to take the steps to get near the door of the room. I felt the skin crawl on my back as the footsteps reached the top step and moved down the hallway. I braced myself. The door creaked slightly as it swung open. I reached out my arms and hoped. My fingers closed around the thick fur of Susan's collar. My body drained with relief. I moved my hands up to touch Susan's face. I was so happy. I no longer wanted to scare her. But as my fingers moved up from the furry collar, there was nothing. Only the bloody stump where Susan's head had been. So, kitties, did it scare ya? Got him. Shimmy knows this was my favorite one. It's the last line. The line seals it for me. It's the same reason why the creepypasta for Doug's Real Life gets me. Only the bloody stump where Susan's head had been. Let me pause the music for a sec. Right? It's a fun little story. Is this a true story? Maybe. Ask Susan. Oh wait, you can't. She's dead. See? I was hoping you guys would like it. It's a fun little thing. So, we're going to do this for just a little bit here. I do want to actually get back to gaming stuff. But, I wanted to make sure I read that story. Now, for you guys, I want to get you guys involved just a little bit. I picked out a particular set of stories from this. So, as you guys can see here, we did the first one, the Furry Collar. But I have a selection here that I want you guys to pick, just by the title alone. Which one should I read next for right now? Whichever one gets at least 2 votes is the one that I'll read. Fuck gaming storytime streams. The thing is, there's only so many stories in this. They're all fairly short. You saw how long that one took. That one was 5 minutes. Some are a little longer, but generally they're short. That one is actually pretty darn short, but they're all like under 10 minutes. Like, they're not long stories. I picked the ones that I felt like would be good for reading, as well as just kind of my favorite ones. There's a couple in here that aren't like super scary. There's like a kind of like a creepy moment or something like that, but I wanted to pick ones that actually I know would be good. Fortune teller. Fortune teller sounds interesting. Okay, that's 2 for the fortune teller. Let's go ahead and do the fortune teller. Now, obviously, we're not getting to all these tonight, but I do want to do this at least like 1, maybe 2 other times during this. So we probably will get through all the ones I selected. But if not, that just means some will be saved for next year. One about a stuffed dog? Well, there is. Come on, Dad, more stories. Alright, so let me go ahead and take this back down. So, let me just kind of take a quick peek at how long this one is. It's a little bit longer, but again, we're talking like another 2 pages, page and a half, two and a half pages, and these are small pages. Alright, so this one is called The Fortune Teller. Mr. Pebbles pushed aside the curtain of glass beads that hung over the entrance to the fortune teller's chamber. He walked inside. Behind him, the beads swung back together with a clatter. Mr. Pebbles was alone in the chamber. He sat down on a chair and surveyed the room. Red and black silk curtains hung all around the walls, alternating in color. The floor was covered with brightly designed Persian carpets. Mr. Pebbles looked up. Painted on the black ceiling were symbols and pictures which he had never seen before. An eerie blue light shone throughout the room. Mr. Pebbles put his hands on his knees and waited. His wife had told him that he would have to wait. It was his wife, in fact, who had persuaded Mr. Pebbles to come to the fortune teller. Mr. Pebbles himself was a far too reasonable man to be interested in hocus-pocus like this, but his wife was a persuasive woman. The swishing sound of silk against silk made Mr. Pebbles look up. The fortune teller had entered the chamber. She was a large woman with long black hair. Her costume was flamboyant. The red full dress was adorned with necklaces, bangles, and a silver belt which had a clasp design of 2 intertwined snakes' heads. "You are Mr. Pebbles," the fortune teller announced this as a fact, not a question. Yes, I am," Mr. Pebbles stammered, suddenly flustered by the presence of this overwhelming woman. "Take my hand and come to the table." The woman reached a heavily bangled arm out to Mr. Pebbles. He drew his arm out to her, and she clutched his hand tightly, almost fiercely. She led him over to one corner of the room where a round table sat. 2 chairs were arranged around it, opposite from each other. "Sit down, Mr. Pebbles, and we will begin." Mr. Pebbles stumbled into the chair to which the fortune teller pointed and sat down. His eyes were riveted on the crystal ball which sat in the dead center of the round table. He looked at it with a mixture of amusement and fear. The chamber was as much as he had expected. It contained all the typical furnishings and paraphernalia of the fortune teller, and yet he was uneasy here. His common sense was disturbed by the presence of this woman, who already exerted a magnetic influence over him. "Look into my eyes, Mr. Pebbles." The fortune teller's voice was strong and suggestive. Mr. Pebbles obeyed. "You have suffered a great misfortune, haven't you, Mr. Pebbles?" she said, staring deep into his eyes. "Yes, that's right," Mr. Pebbles began. "You lost your job you had for 20 years, didn't you, Mr. Pebbles?" Now it seemed to Mr. Pebbles that the fortune teller could see behind his eyes into his brain. "How did you know?" he asked dreamily. "I know," the fortune teller replied, "and I know more. You fear death, don't you, Mr. Pebbles? You feel the hand of death tightening around your neck." At that moment, Mr. Pebbles' neck did seem to be choked by an invisible hand. He began to pour out what had been haunting him all these past months. "Yes, I fear death, yes. I fear that life has passed me by and all that's left for me is death." "Poor Mr. Pebbles," the fortune teller's voice went on soothingly. "Let me consult the crystal ball." The fortune teller led Mr. Pebbles' gaze from her eyes down to the crystal ball. It radiated an intense blue light, the eerie blue glow that Mr. Pebbles had noticed in the room earlier. The fortune teller began to drone a rhythmic chant as she stared into the crystal ball. Then, suddenly, she sucked in her breath. Mr. Pebbles shifted his eyes from the crystal ball to her face. Her eyes were burning, and the black brows were knit together. "I see doom before you, Mr. Pebbles. What the crystal ball has told me is not pleasant. It gives a black picture of your future. Death." Her words were drowned out by Mr. Pebbles' shriek of despair. His fears had been right. Death was stalking him. He felt the fortune teller's fingers entwine in his. Mr. Pebbles, we must all die. You must simply accept it and provide for your loved ones." Mr. Pebbles came out of his reverie. Loved ones, yes. He must provide for his beloved wife, Margaret. His darling Margaret. Mr. Pebbles left the fortune teller's chamber in a daze. He stumbled from the dark room, penetrated by the eerie blue light, out into the darker blackness of the winter night. As he drove his car home, he made himself a promise. No matter what came to him and how soon, he would take care of Margaret. Margaret was standing in the hallway, waiting for him, when he arrived home. To a stranger, they would have appeared to be father and daughter. She was, in fact, 15 years younger than her husband. "Margaret, it's awful. She said just what I feared." Mr. Pebbles poured out his experience with the fortune teller to his wife. She listened to his story, stroking his balding head with her soft hands. "Margaret, you will be cared for. Don't worry. I plan to take out a $100,000 life insurance policy. Do whatever you want, dear, but stop this horrible talk of death. I won't hear it anymore. You laughed as I first suggested you go to a fortune teller, and now you take her silly predictions so seriously. Mr. Pebbles felt better after that. He and his wife went to bed. The first thing Mr. Pebbles did the next morning was visit his insurance broker. Despite the broker's advice to the contrary, he insisted he take out a new insurance policy immediately. The beneficiary would be, of course, his wife. Mr. Pebbles felt much better as he drove home from the insurance office, despite the meaning of what he had just done. He fell into a daydream about Margaret, how she could always keep the house and live as she did now. Screech! Mr. Pebbles' foot trembled on the brake pedal. The train engine flashed before him, followed by a constant whiz of boxcars. Their trembling wheels on the track kept time with Mr. Pebbles' pounding heart. The fortune teller had been right about death. He had just barely escaped it. When he got home, Mr. Pebbles told his wife about the train. She lay down on the couch and sobbed. To comfort her, he brought out the insurance policy. He kept repeating to her how she would always be protected. That afternoon, Mr. Pebbles went out into the garage where he did small projects with wood to keep himself busy. Now he needed to get his mind off the morning incident with the train. He cleaned off his work table area, putting tools back into their proper drawers. There seemed to be a knife he had misplaced. He rummaged through more drawers. Then he reached up on a cabinet high above the table. As he pulled the door open, the missing knife fell from the cabinet ledge. Its sharp blade plunged down an inch away from his terrified eyes. The knife dug into the wooden workbench and vibrated from the force of its impact. Mr. Pebbles backed away in fear. There was a death jinx on him. Mr. Pebbles spent the rest of the afternoon lying on the couch in his study. He was paralyzed with fear. Death's bony hand seemed to be tightening its grip around his neck. He refused the dinner his wife brought him. He refused to even talk with her. Finally, in the late evening, he felt he must get out of the house. He decided to take a walk along the deserted road near the house. He would be safe there. No traffic was allowed on the path. "Margaret," he called out to his wife, "I'm going to take a walk on the old mill road. I'll be a while. Please don't wait up for me." Margaret came into the room and watched her husband dress for his walk. "You'll be careful, won't you? Remember what that fortune teller said?" "Yes, I'll be careful, Margaret." Mr. Pebbles kissed his wife's lips. "I'll see you later," he said as he went out the door. Margaret waited until she heard the door shut. Then, with a smile on her face, she walked over to the telephone. Along the path that was once the old mill road, Mr. Pebbles shuffled his feet through the dead autumn leaves. He let his memories of his life drift in and out of his mind. It seemed so peaceful on the path. Mr. Pebbles began to think that the fortune teller might be wrong. Then, he was blinded by two headlights. Speeding toward him, down the path in the middle of the old road, there was a huge car. He knew immediately that this was the end. Death had him in a stranglehold at last. Mr. Pebbles stared at death as it bore down on him. In the seconds before he died, he saw the face that death wore. It was the face of the fortune teller behind the wheel of the car, and on the dashboard in front of her was the crystal ball. It was the wife! Pause. I ain't saying she's a gold digger, but she ain't gonna live her life broke. Mr. Pebbles is in some kinky stuff. Yes. As soon as he left, she was like, "Oh, fortune teller, get him." I might die. Time to go outside where anything could happen. Right? It's like, I'm going to go for a walk on this road. It's deserted. No cars. That doesn't mean you can't die to something else, right? And that's side dough. No Mr. Accent on the dough. I think that was kind of cool. It's not as like scare thing at the end of only the bloody stump, but it's just like, oh, it's the fortune teller, and then it's like, oh, well, it's actually just insurance, kind of. I say an insurance scam. Does that technically count? I would say, because I want to make sure we have enough to go around, let's do at least one more. At least one more for tonight. Let's go ahead and bring the list back up. If you guys would, again, pick, whichever one gets 2 picks is what we'll go with. Obviously, we're not going to do ones we've already done. Nothing for Zebo, sorry. He's not in there. He's not in here. 10 Claws voted again by Shimmy. Insurance fraud. All right, Coolio also says the 10 claws. I like this one. Shimmy probably remembers this one too. That's probably why he's picking it. It's bullshit. Well, you write to JB Stamper and Scholastic and you complain to them. All right, we'll do the 10 claws next. All right, where is the 10 claws? Page 18. Just kind of take a peeky peek. How many pages? About the same number of pages as the last one. You just like the name? Well, hopefully you like the story too. You betrayed the claws. Claws. All right, anyways. Scary Tory. Scary time. Scary Tory? Scary story time. All right, the 10 claws. Long ago, a small village was plagued by a monster. The monster had never been seen nor heard. It never left tracks or evidence. The only proof of its existence was its victims. The victims were always killed in the same way. 10 jagged holes would be found in their necks. At first, the monster attacked only small animals. The farmer woke one morning to find that 3 of his sheep had bled to death. Then 3 pet dogs in the village were found dead, with the same strange claw marks in their necks. Rumors circulated in the village. Everyone heard about the animals, but no one could give a logical explanation for what had killed them. Next, a young calf was found dead. It had bled to death too, its jugular vein punctured by the 10 mysterious holes. After this, men began to arm themselves. Shotguns were set beside beds at night. Animals were kept locked in the barns. Throughout the village, a rash of hysteria broke loose. People put forth all kinds of wild speculation. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion. Then, it happened. What everyone had really feared. The monster attacked a human. Elmer Riley, the town drunk. Elmer was found dead one morning with the 10 claw holes in his neck. He had died just like the sheep and the dogs and the calf. He had bled to death. Not many people in the town really cared that Elmer was dead, but it scared them to know that the monster had an appetite for humans as well. Anyone could be its prey. The men in the village banded together to form a vigilante group. They didn't know what they were fighting, which made things even worse. Robert and John Harmon, 2 brothers, were appointed head of the vigilante committee. They lived on the outskirts of the village, near the forest where most people thought the monster lived. The 2 brothers knew how the monster attacked. It had been their calf that was killed. After the first meeting of the vigilante committee, Robert and John Harmon went home to discuss their plans. They sat around the oak table in the kitchen with their father. Their old grandmother sat by the fireplace on a low chair, her black shawl wrapped around her. "We must begin the watch tonight," Robert said in a low voice. "The other men are afraid to act now, but I think tonight is the time to be on guard." "You're right," his brother agreed. "The thing is, whatever it is, strikes every 5 days. It was 5 nights ago that Elmer Riley was killed." "You boys sound brave," their father interrupted. "But remember what you're dealing with. The thing seems to attack without warning. In the killing so far, there were no signs of struggle. How will you know what to watch for?" The father paused and looked over to his old mother sitting by the fireplace. "They should be careful, shouldn't they, Granny?" The old woman looked up at her son. She shuddered for a moment and then fell silent again. The 3 men went back to their conversation. They hadn't really expected to get an answer from her. Her mind had been foggy for years. Robert began to outline his plan to his father. "John and I will both take our guns to the outskirts of the forest tonight. We'll set ourselves up on the path between the forest and the village. If the monster comes out tonight, we'll have to pass by either of us." "What protection will you have?" the father asked worriedly. "Each other," Robert answered. "We'll stay within shouting distance of each other. We'll keep our backs to the village so that we face the forest and the monster." "Someone has to do it," John said to his father. "We don't know who the next victim will be. We can't just sit back and let the monster kill us off one by one." Their father stood up from the table and walked around the room once. Then he shook each of their hands. "Come back to me alive," he said, his voice choking. The 2 sons picked up their rifles from the floor. Robert pulled a long, sharp machete up from off the wall. As they left the room, both of them walked over to the old grandmother and kissed her goodbye. Outside, the night was nearly pitch black. A thin sliver of the moon hung low in the western sky. They walked east toward the forest. As they drew near to where they had planned to station themselves, John whispered, "I wonder what it looks like." "I've been thinking," Robert said, "that it could be a bird. A giant bird that swoops down on, digs its claws into your neck." They both looked up into the night sky. Clouds had shrouded the thin moon. It'd be hard to see a dark shadow descending through the sky. "I thought it might tunnel under the ground like a huge weasel," John said softly. "Then it comes out and attacks you from behind." Both brothers felt the skin crawl on their backs and their necks. Slowly, they both turned and looked behind them. For several minutes, they stood together like that in the dark, paralyzed by their own terrible thoughts. "We must take our places," Robert said finally. "But remember, stay within shouting distance." The two brothers moved off in opposite directions. They had agreed that each would stand 20 long paces and then stop. Take 20 long paces, then stop. Standing in the dark, Robert carefully cocked his gun. Then he took the machete and stuck it in the soft ground by his feet. He waited. 40 paces away, John fumbled nervously with his gun. He felt his hand shaking. Could he use the gun if he had to? He wished he could see Robert, but his brother was obscured by the dark shadows of bushes and trees. John looked around to look toward the village. He wished he was safe inside the house. Then he heard the cracking of a twig in the back of him. He spun around to face the forest, but he saw nothing and heard no more. John relaxed. He set the butt of his gun down on the ground and leaned against it. He started to feel drowsy. Then he felt the 10 claws digging into his neck. A terrified scream echoed throughout the forest to Robert. He grabbed his gun and machete and followed the awful screams to his brother. He drew near, but he couldn't see anything in the dark night. But then he heard John's voice, choking and desperate. "Quick, swing the machete behind where you hear my voice. Hurry!" Robert threw down his gun and grasped the machete in both hands. He swung it above his head and let it fall. It made a hacking sound before it hit the ground. John had been moaning the whole time, but now he stopped. For an instant, Robert thought he had killed his brother, but then John started to babble incoherently. Robert thought he had heard something moving back away from them. It sounded like a giant rat scuttling over the dead leaves, but he could not see it. He fell down on the ground by his brother's body. Moaning again, John took his brother's hand and put it onto his own neck. Robert shrunk back at what he felt. It was a hand. A withered hand with sharp, pointed claws. He had hacked it off the monster with his machete, and it was still stuck in John's neck. Robert jerked the foul claws from his brother's neck, and then he bound the 10 bloody holes with his handkerchief. He carried his brother back to the village, leaving the withered hand lying on the forest floor. Their father met them at the door, weeping with fear. He had heard John's terrified screams in the forest. Now he wept with happiness to see that both his sons were alive yet. They laid John out on the couch and washed out the claw marks in his neck. They could see that a few seconds more and the claws would have killed him. As he bandaged his brother's neck, Robert thought about the monster. He hoped it was in the forest now, dying a slow death. All this time, no one had noticed that the old woman was gone from her spot by the fireplace, and no one noticed when she came in through the back door and sat down there again. From her low seat, she looked over to Robert and John. No one heard the hiss that came from her wrinkled mouth, and no one saw the bloody stump that she'd hid under her black shawl. And everybody lived happily ever after. Ta-da! It was the grandma! She's like, "Hey, I'll get you, my pretties." It's either the butler or the grandma. Honestly, Coolio, the music has worked out so far. I'm using some royalty-free horror music. It's pretty fucking cool. And yeah, it's worked out pretty well. I think it hits eventually a later part in the track that's maybe not quite as slow and haunting, a little more upbeat, but we didn't get to that part of it here. No, everyone died happily ever after. That's not how it works. Anyways, we did that for this whole session here is taking about like half an hour or so, slightly less. So yeah, this was a fun little thing I wanted to do as like little intermission time or ending a night and all that. So I do want to do this at least one more time with the number of streams that I have left here. Depending on, we might have realistically maybe 2 more sessions. It kind of depends on the last night, on how long that game takes. But I don't want to give you guys too much here now, and I do want to spend the next about last hour of the stream tonight starting the next game, because it is going to take longer than Insanity for sure on its own. So I want to make sure I start getting some progress on it. I do like, see, I knew this would be a fun little idea for you guys. The thing is, though, I can only do it so much. I eventually would run out anyways, especially of the good ones. And I don't want to do it too often because then it kind of kills some of the magic. See, it's a fun little book for a kid. Like, ooh, creepy little stories, nothing crazy out there, but it's got a lot of it is in the last paragraph. Pretty much the main things happen at the very end of the story, but that's fine. It ends on a nice like, oh note, 5 more, step up my game. Start our own midnight society. Yeah, well, I'm not good at making up my own stories. I'm only good at reading the ones here, and I'm trying my best to like read it in like a quick but also like proper manner, and try to keep it in the right mood. Scary stories to tell in the dark. Well, thank you, Shimmy. I do my best. Certainly better than having my brother read them. Ho! All right, that's it for the intermission for right now. Like I said, I do want to do story time at least 1 more, maybe 2 more times. I have 2 more times scheduled out. Whether both happen depends on how long the games go. So on that note, let me go ahead and switch it up again. Give me a sec here. And we're going to load up the next game that we're going to start tonight, but we won't finish it.